Welcome to the 100th anniversary of the 1913 Great Lakes Storm, also known as the White Hurricane. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about the winds that occurred in this storm. This storm was one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike the Great Lakes. It had a whiteout blizzard conditions across the Great Lakes, especially in the lake effect snow regions. The storm reached its peak intensity on November 9th and 10th, 100 years ago in 1913. There are hurricane-force wind gusts that were associated with the storm. We're going to talk more about that in this presentation. There were a dozen major shipwrecks, estimated over 250 lives lost. Because of the historical significance of this storm, 100 years later, NOAA is commemorating that through information on a web page, as well as several of these presentations. To look at how the winds evolved in the storm, we performed some forensic study of the meteorological parameters, and we did this through the use of a computer model with the limited data that was available back in 1913. If you'd like more information on how this computer model was developed, how it was used to look back 100 years, and how this storm developed, please look at our other presentations that we have available through YouTube on the overview of this particular storm. At its peak, in the early morning hours of November 10th, the storm was positioned over southwest Ontario. Leading up to this point, the storm went through a rapid deepening phase over Pennsylvania and eastern Lake Erie before it reached this point. All along its way, it was producing some strong winds, even as it was developing, when it reached its peak intensity here, and then continued to produce strong winds and the associated waves as it continued off to the northeast as it was weakening. When we look at the wind profile of this storm, our surface low here on the afternoon of November 9th was just entering Pennsylvania. Still, at this point already, there were some pretty significant winds going over the Great Lakes. Everything in yellow over Lakes Huron, Michigan, and Superior indicate winds of 30 knots or more. That's roughly 35 miles an hour. These are the sustained winds and not the gusts, which we'll look at in just a little bit. As we move forward in time to the evening of November 9th, the sustained winds were 30 to 45 knots over these upper lakes of Huron, Michigan, and Superior. When we get up to 45 knots, that's where we see the brighter orange colors over Lake Huron, and that's where we have winds of 52 miles an hour. Now the storm has reached its peak intensity. It's positioned over southwest Ontario, and the winds over the upper lakes and even into Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are starting to increase. Wind speeds over all the lakes are somewhere between 30 and 45 knots. That's 35 to 52 miles an hour, and again, that is the sustained wind. That doesn't count the gust. Maximum winds at this point are starting to move over Lake Superior in Michigan. When we look at the wind gust, on the afternoon of November 9th as that storm was developing and moving towards the Great Lakes, winds were already gusting to 45 knots over Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior, with the maximum winds you notice over Lake Michigan in excess of 50 knots, almost 60 miles an hour. As we move forward in time to the evening of November 9th, wind gusts start to increase even more. Most of the lakes and the upper lakes into Lake Erie now are starting to see wind gusts of 55 to 60 knots. That's almost 70 miles an hour. The maximum winds at this point in the late evening hours are over Lake Huron, where winds are gusting in excess of hurricane force up to 70 knots, which is 81 miles an hour. After we pass midnight and we get into the early morning hours of November 10th, that peak wind gust intensity has moved to Lake Superior and northern Lake Michigan. Still, you can see how all the lakes have storm conditions with frequent wind gusts in excess of 50 knots, and you can see how the mariners were experiencing those storm conditions. Reports from 1913 did indicate winds were between 80 and 90 miles an hour in the wind gust from the mariners that were caught out in this storm. And that certainly shows up in our model simulation with the peak wind of 70 knots or higher moving from Lake Huron to Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. As we go further in time, as the storm was just slowly starting to weaken, the wind gusts start to subside just ever so much as winds were gusting between 50 and 60 knots over most of the Great Lakes. And this trend of a slow decrease in winds continue on as that storm continues to pull off to the northeast towards Quebec. If you'd like more information on the 100-year anniversary of our 1913 White Hurricane storm, I encourage you to look at the website listed below. There's a lot of information on that website, including additional web presentations about the overview of the storm and the wave spectrum as that storm moved through the Great Lakes.